in the last episode, episode 3, we learned that the 1916 Rising, although it was a military failure, it was a political success. It completely changed the political landscape of Ireland. And we're going to learn in this episode some key events from 1917 and 1918. These include, in 1917, the release of the prisoners who were imprisoned after the 1916 Rising, the death and hunger strike of Thomas Ashe. We're going to then look at the Conscription Crisis in 1918 and the general election in 1918. So to start us off, let's go back to Sinn Fein. Sinn Fein was founded in 1905 by Arthur Griffith. It was a political group that wanted to contest the elections for Westminster, but ignore Westminster and establish a Republican Parliament at home. That was their plan, but they were a minority group amongst Irish nationalists. Sinn Fein had no official part in the 1916 Rising, even though its founder Arthur Griffith was friends with many who were involved, and some members of Sinn Fein were involved in the Rising themselves. But however, after the Rising, it became known as the Sinn Fein Rebellion because one newspaper called it that. Sinn Fein then became the main political Republican party from 1917 onwards. It was reorganised and restructured by the surviving Republicans. Eamon de Valera became the new president, and Arthur Griffith, who was originally the founder and president, I wouldn't say got demoted, but stepped down and became vice president. So during this time, about 3,000 men and women had been imprisoned after the 1916 Rising. Many had nothing to do with the Rising and became politicised in prison, as we've seen in the last episodes, like Frongach Revolutionary Camp in Wales, where Michael Collins rose to the ranks. But these prisoners in late 1917 were released. It's called a general amnesty. So the British had no space and wanted to keep America happy, so they released all the prisoners. And upon release, the prisoners sought leadership. They came out and they were looking for leadership. What's the next step? What do we do now? Many of them joined local Sinn Féin branches around the country. The funeral of Thomas Ashe. As I said, he was the leader of the Fingal Battalion in the 1916 Rising, and he engaged in the Battle of Ashburn, one of the most successful battles. And after his release from prison, he was doing a speaking campaign, and he was imprisoned for sedition, speaking publicly against the Empire. He was imprisoned in Mountjoy, and he went on hunger strike. And during hunger strike, he was force-fed, and basically food got caught in his lungs, and he died. And his funeral was a major event. It was the first gathering of Irish Republicans since the 1916 Rising a year before. And also, his treatment that he received in prison and the way he died by force feeding enhanced anti-British feeling in Ireland. Don't forget, all of this is taking place during World War I, one of the biggest wars in history. And it was looking like the British were going to bring in conscription. Conscription is where all men of eligible age would be forced into the army. So they were getting desperate for soldiers, and there was huge speculation that they were going to conscript Irish men into the British Army. And this would happen within a moment's notice. So there was huge fear around Ireland. It's hard to underestimate how important this fear was, to the point where, reasonably, the British had plans to cut off every corner, say in Dublin City, in the middle of the night. And when people woke to go to work that morning, they wouldn't be allowed to leave the street. They'd be taken on to British armoured vehicles and brought straight over to take part in the war. So there was a huge campaign against conscription by Dublin Corporation, by the Catholic Church, and by Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin got most of the credit when conscription was not brought in. And this increased their popularity with the people. So why we're mentioning the conscription crisis? One, it led to the Irish Volunteers, the group who took part in the Rising, gaining many members. And two, Sinn Féin got the credit for the political campaign against conscription. So basically the Irish were saved. It was announced conscription is not going to be brought in, and Sinn Féin's popularity is boosted hugely because of this. Now, another thing we're going to go on to here is 1918 general election. So what ended in 1918? World War I. And after the war, it's election time. Any elections had been postponed due to the war. It's an emergency situation. Remember, we are under Britain, so this election is for Westminster. So when the war ended, to honour the contribution of working class men and women, the British changed the franchise. The franchise means who can vote. So now women who could never vote, they could now vote if they were aged over 30 and if they owned property. And all men over the age of 21 could now vote. So the results of the election in Ireland were a major change. The Home Rule Party, who were originally the major nationalist party in Ireland, they got 6 seats. Sinn Fein, who were basically got 0 before, got 73, and the Unionists got 23. And just to compare this, in 1911, which was the election previous, Home Rule got 73, so now in 1918 they got 6. Sinn Féin got 0 in 1911, and now they have 73 seats. So basically Sinn Féin took all of Home Rule's voters. Now, there's a few reasons why Sinn Féin did so well. Number 1, Sinn Féin gained huge popularity over the links to the 1916 Rising, which was now seen as a very popular event in Irish history. Many Sinn Féin leaders were arrested by the British before the election, and this gained sympathy because people thought it wasn't fair. The British are doing this to try to damage Sinn Féin's chance, and people saw an injustice and decided to support Sinn Féin. Another reason is the Conscription Crisis popularity that they gained. They had younger voters and female voters who had no old attachment to the Home Rule Party, and they were more radical. So they changed the vote and they voted for Sinn Féin rather than Home Rule. So these years are the in-between years. So we looked at 1916. So now, as I just recap here, 1917, Thomas Ashe's funeral, the reorganisation of Sinn Féin, the Conscription Crisis, and the election in 1918. We will not look at the first Dáil, we'll look at that in the next video, which will hopefully be a shorter video. So until next time, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's Miss Murphy from Know Your History.